This is chapter 2. We're going to talk about educating patients in a new and exciting way and the various options you have available to you when you educate patients. There are a lot of different things to consider, a lot of things to look for, a lot of things to get ready. We're going to talk about different sources for material and where you get them. Sometimes you have to make your own. Other times you can get things from pharmaceutical companies in particular, or companies that make or manufacture medical devices. These can be a little suspect. The government actually does a great job of providing a lot of interesting material. A lot of it is free. Of course, professional organizations or support organizations also offer a lot of information. Types of patient information available, there's a lot. So a basic overview. Make sure that your stuff is from a reputable source. Make sure that if you create your own material, that it is of a high quality. That you give information in the appropriate language for your patient. Assess the patient's reading and learning level. Even though they're adults, it doesn't necessarily mean they can read. Give information at the appropriate learning level. Don't overstep something and don't understep something either. That's just insulting. Give your patient enough information to allow him or her to search out more information on their own. So give them a good starting point, but you don't necessarily have to give them everything. As a matter of fact, you probably can't. But do your best. Give them a nice starting point. Don't expect your patient to be able to distinguish good stuff from bad stuff out there. There's so much information now available at the touch of a finger. But learning to be savvy about what's useful and what's not, that takes time and a lot of education in and of itself. Sometimes cost is a factor. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Make sure that the material you offer is not biased in any way. Stay away from opinion pieces and family blogs. And you can point people to those on the internet, but they're not usually good for solid information. And then watch for appropriateness, especially when you're dealing with minors, with children. Make sure that whatever you show them is appropriate. Okay. Fact sheets. Fact sheets are readily available. There are pros and cons to these. A lot of times they're available from the government or from drug manufacturers. A lot of hospitals have these available, like in the ER. There's going to be a stack of these. There's a whole cubby full of these various information sheets. You can get them at your local drugstore, and they're really basic. They have good information, and they also tell you where to find more information. So a lot of times they have a website printed on them and stuff, but they may not be at the right learning level. So on the pro side, they're usually short, they're very basic, they don't cost much. It's usually a Xeroxed piece of paper. They're easily accessible. A lot of times they're online, and so if you run out, you can just download more. They're kind of personalized, but not really. I say kind of because you can certainly pick and choose which of these pages you give to someone. If someone has macular degeneration, you don't necessarily need to send them home with a paper talking about lung disease. Then again, they might need both pieces of paper. So personalized in that you can give them more than one piece of paper, not personalized though in general. So they may not have enough information, and they may be expensive if you're leasing them from a database. There are pamphlets available. They're small and they're easy to hand out. You can get them from health departments, professional societies, disease-specific groups. They're short, they're to the point. Sometimes the pharmaceutical companies will give you stacks of these for free. The health department also offers them, particularly if it's a current trend. So, for example, recently there have been a lot of public relation pushes to be sure that people don't lock their children in hot cars. Well, that means that those pamphlets are going to be more readily available right this minute than they may be in the future, or maybe than they have been in the past. Now, the nice thing is that these may be really locally specific. So if you get one from the Clark County Health Department, it's going to be more specific to the needs of Clark County residents, as opposed to generic good nationwide. And they may also tell you about local services that are available in your community. The cons, again, they lack personalization. There's a lot of potential for bias, particularly if you get them from a drug company, and they may not be of a sufficient size to give the patient a lot of information. If you have ever created a pamphlet, you'll know what I'm talking about. You can only put little blurbs in sections when you create a pamphlet, so it glosses over a lot. So it's a nice place to start, but they can also be expensive depending on how many you have printed or the cardstock. Books. Well, there are millions of books available, that's for sure, but books can be really expensive. So one of the pros is that you get tons of information in a book. Of course, that means someone has to read all that information, and if your patient is not an avid reader, then a book is probably not the best choice. For a child, though, a book may be great, especially if it has a lot of pictures and things, but we have some other book type materials that we'll talk about in a minute. Sometimes you can get these free or low cost, or you may be able to print your own or print on demand, and so you can keep the cost down sometimes. The new Affordable Care Act has grants listed in the act. If you haven't read the Affordable Care Act, I suggest that you do that. It will take about 3 or 4 hours. You'll find that a lot of it is repetitive, but there's a lot of interesting stuff in the Affordable Care Act that no one knows about. I was pretty shocked when I read it. For example, did you know that there are scholarships available that might help you pay for this particular class in the Affordable Care Act? I bet you didn't. You should go check that out. And if anybody's interested, I'll post a link for that. But back to our topic at hand. The books, if they are not free or low cost, then they can be really high cost. So if you can't get a grant, you can't figure out a way to obtain these inexpensively, then you can look at other resources. For example, my favorite website is paperbackswap.com, where you can ask other people to just give you books. So if there's a book that's particularly good that you would like to give to patients on a regular basis, you could keep putting your name on the list, and every time you got a free copy, you could put your name back on the list and get another free copy. Now, it's not good if you're doing volume work with a lot of patients, but if there's a book and you just need 1 or 2 copies, or you want a copy for yourself, this is a free way to get them. There are other book swapping websites out there, so it's something to keep in mind. You can't really personalize information. I mean, let's face it, it's a book, and it can be pretty overwhelming because there's so much of it, but it's one option for your patients. Magazines. There are some great magazines out there. Make sure that if you pick out a magazine article, that it comes from a reputable magazine. Try to find healthcare related magazines, not, People magazine. Find appropriate source material. Now, a cool thing about magazines is if you find a good article, you can just Xerox copies and start spreading them around. Now, watch it though. There may be copyrights on that, and you might have to get permission to use an article. But a lot of times, no one knows the difference. No one checks. So I have to tell you that you may need to get permission to give out an article, but nobody's really going to check. So keep that in mind. Unfortunately, once the article is published, it's basically old news, and so you can't update it, and it may or may not be relevant. So keep in mind that you need to be looking at newer magazines and not old issues, because old issues of a magazine may not have up-to-date current information. Journal articles certainly are better when it comes to technical, true, solid knowledge, but they may be too medical in their writing, too technical, and patients may not understand the jargon. So again, pick and choose. There are a lot of patient-driven magazines. You'll see these laying around at the doctor's office, and they're really superficial. Sometimes they have good information, but it's usually not very in-depth. I mean, the whole point of those magazines is to be able to read an article in a short period of time while a patient is waiting to be seen by the physician. So they may or may not be useful, but as you in your daily life go places and see these magazines, make sure you check them out. Who knows, one of them might be worthwhile, and a lot of times those patient magazines are offered free to practitioners to give out to patients. There's a lot of advertising in there, so they want to get those out to as many places as they can. Be sure that you are careful with religious or controversial content before you offer it up to someone. Photonovellas are relatively new options. It's a format really similar to comic books, only instead of having pictures of drawings, illustrations, they may be actual photos of people, and they use more thought bubbles to convey information. So they really have done a lot of research when they prepare these, and they are generally prepared for the Spanish-speaking population. But if someone doesn't have a good solid grasp of the English language, then sometimes these little photonovellas are a good option because they're short and they're usually so basic that you don't necessarily need to understand English to read them. They may be also appropriate for younger patients, not necessarily little tiny children, but maybe at the age of 8, 9, 10 years old. They're relatively new, and you may not be able to get them. You may have to make your own. Keep that in mind. And they are not always culturally appropriate. You certainly don't want to give one of these to, say, a family from the Middle East, more traditional Muslims, when they're showing women without burqas on. That may be offensive to the people culturally. And so, be careful that you don't offend a patient with the cultural variation inside this photonovella. Also, if you offer this to some patients, they will be offended simply because it's so low level. They will feel insulted. It's like you thought, well, I don't think you can read, or I don't think you can understand English, so I'm going to give you this really simple, plain Jane material written at a really low level. There are people who are from other countries who are really very intelligent. They just don't speak English really well. Those intelligent people may be offended by something so simple. So, sometimes you can't help it and you do your best. It's good if you're worried to just preface this by saying, I realize this is not really at your level, but this is all I have with me today that might be appropriate for you. There are diagrams or pictures or posters, sometimes models that can be used to demonstrate things that are going on. We had some of these in the classroom. I know you've all seen them. So these models are pretty nifty, and they can be used to truly demonstrate what's going on with a patient inside. So it's like a cutaway of the inside of their body. Unfortunately, these can be hard to get a hold of, although if you want some websites where you can order these, I can certainly give you that. There's one, it's like Lakeview, I think, lakeview.com, but they're pretty expensive, so even a small, tiny one can be $400 or $500. Sometimes, though, you can get drug companies to give these to you, and often the free ones are a little bit smaller in size, but they're free. So if you can get one of these free or low cost, certainly take it. Posters sometimes can be available through the CDC, so check the government website. The CDC has lots of free stuff. It's really kind of amazing what you can order from the CDC for free, and the CDC changes this stuff up regularly. So in the past, I have personally ordered posters that were like anti-smoking posters. I ordered a whole kit that educated people on how to do mannitol test for tuberculosis. So there's all kinds of fun stuff you can get, and like I said, it changes regularly. So check the CDC. If you are a good artist, maybe you can draw a picture and make copies of this and show people. So there are lots of different options here, and all you have to do is make sure that it's appropriate for the patient and that they will understand what you're showing them. And sometimes this is a nice alternative for the language barrier people we were talking about earlier. Audio visuals. We're going to see more and more of this, as I said before, with iPads being available. You can sometimes hook people up with podcasts that are updated regularly, so they can just subscribe to them on iTunes and have ongoing education when you're not around. It can be free. Oftentimes it's free, like on iTunes. Sometimes you have to pay for it, but not usually. There are other things you can do. For example, some of you may remember doing this. You could actually make a movie and perhaps a coloring book and maybe a parental book to go along with this, and you could package it together and give it to doctors so that they give it to patients for example, asthma education. Hey, if any of you guys have that, send it to me and I'll see if we can upload it, or you guys can upload it. I have it somewhere. I'll have to dig that out. I think everybody has seen it. I make every class watch it. You guys were fabulous, by the way. So the cost of this may be prohibited only because you have to have the equipment to watch this in the first place. But anymore, you don't often run by somebody who doesn't have a phone. And frequently, if they have an iPhone, they could get iTunes and therefore podcasts on their phone. So whereas it used to be a bigger problem to make sure someone had a computer or an MP3 player, today that technological span of people who didn't have the technology, it's going away. So make sure that your patient has access to the hardware that they need in order to play with this interactive stuff. But if they don't anymore, heck, people are getting free phones from the government. So there's all kinds of options out there in these cases. Now, beware. Some of the material is really crappy. I mean, there's not a nice way to put it. Sometimes this stuff is just awful. Sometimes it's because it's on YouTube and Bob Smith decided he was going to upload a video about the COPD his grandfather has. And to be honest, the guy doesn't know anything about COPD, and he's sure that his dad got it because, he mowed lawns for the school district or something. You never know what you're going to get. So this is where being a savvy consumer is really important, and you need to really assess a podcast or the video stuff beforehand before you recommend it to a patient. Make sure you have watched it. Some older patients may not be comfortable with this media, but this is going to sound terrible, but as they die off, it's not going to be a problem anymore. The internet. So again, most everybody has access to the internet, at least via their phone. But remember, on your phone, you can't always see or access all possible information. So this is good and bad. Generally, it's available to most people. It's very easily accessible, and it's getting easier to do searches. Government websites and large hospitals, universities, journals are all online. And it's really cool what you can find it, like, for example, the Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic. They put all kinds of really great stuff online. So offer that up to patients and really tell them those are good sites. You're going to get good, solid, real information from there. The British government also has a lot of health-related information posted. I think that's probably because they have, the equivalent of universal health care. And so it's in their best interest to keep their patients as healthy as possible. The information that people find may or may not be accurate, which again is why you need to really help focus where people are looking for their information. You should truly assess everything before you recommend it. Some sources you do have to pay for, but not many. The ones that you have to pay for are usually to access journal articles. A lot of times hospitals will have already paid this, and so if you're at work, you can get access to lots of databases that you wouldn't be able to access at home without paying sometimes a lot of money. Some of these subscriptions cost several $1,000s a year. Some of them are $40 or $50, and some are, well, a lot more. And so if you have access to some of those at work, you might find good articles, download those, and make hard copies for your patients. Clinician-run classes. This is a really popular thing, particularly in the diabetic world. When people have new onset diabetes, they frequently go to classes where they teach them how to draw their blood sugar, teach them how to give themselves insulin, signs and symptoms to look for when things are going bad. But there are a lot of other classes too. There are classes run at Nellis Air Force Base to stop smoking, for example, and those are available to any service member or their family members who want to stop smoking. In addition to that, while you take that class, as long as you enroll and keep going, at least they used to give you the patch and or Zyban or one of the other medications for free, as long as you were going to the class. There are weight management classes. There are certainly the classes that are run at any rehab center that you can think of. So pulmonary rehab, cardiac rehab, those frequently have classes on things like traveling with your oxygen, changing your diet and health cooking classes, exercise classes. So there are tons and tons and tons of these available. Again, in the Affordable Care Act, there was a whole lot of money set aside for anybody who wanted to start these classes. And a lot of times the grants are for 3-year training programs. So it's something to consider. A big push in the Affordable Care Act was to do preventative maintenance, and educating patients about their diseases is part of that preventative maintenance. The good thing is that these skills, or the things that people learn, these classes, are taught by professionals, and they're usually evaluated. And so even if you get somebody to take a CPR class can't be taught by just anybody. It's got to be taught by someone who has been trained to teach. So that's great. On the upside, patients can get really high quality information in a compressed setting where they get to interact with others and get to demonstrate their psychomotor skills. So there's a lot of pros to this. The cons, however, that it may be cost prohibitive. Sometimes insurance companies will pay for these classes, other times they will not. And sometimes it depends on what the disease is. For example, they might be willing to pay for a diabetic class, but they may not be willing to pay for cooking classes for weight management. Then again, it could be the other way around. They may be, especially since we have money available now through the Affordable Care Act, they may be run by inappropriate people. So right now, if any one of you wanted to start one of these classes, you could apply for a grant from the federal government in order to teach one of these classes. And while any one of you listening to this now would be fully capable of teaching a pulmonary-based class, I don't know if you guys are all capable, really well, of teaching a class in diabetes. And if some of you could, and some of you wouldn't have the basic knowledge. That doesn't mean you can't teach yourself the basic knowledge or learn it, but it means that you will not be as good at teaching it as someone who either lives with the disease or has had the training course themselves. Just something to keep in mind. Also, the groups may vary, and it's like any other class. Sometimes you get a good class, and they pay attention to the teacher, and they don't cause trouble, and other times they're just rotten to the core, and you can't control them, and therefore the other patients in the room are not going to pay any attention. Also know that the person teaching the class may have to get certified before they're legally eligible to teach this, or at least eligible in such a way that the hospital or whoever's sponsoring it would get insurance reimbursement, and that training could be extremely expensive. So it's something, if you really want to take a training course and you want to set up one of these classes, you should go to your hospital and you need to sell it to them. You need to explain to them what the benefit is to their patients, and then maybe you can get them to pay for your training. There are a lot of different sources of material. As I said, pharmaceutical companies are some of the easiest ones to find. You can look on their websites and find all kinds of stuff. There are, by the way, you can check your PDR in the back and it will have basically every drug company's listed in there if you can't Google them. Again, professional medical organizations, so you can look at medical specialties. For example, you can look up the American Academy of Pediatrics if you want to find pediatric related material. Or you can look at, say, the AARC, for example. The federal government, state and local governments, and health departments have lots of stuff available, medical journals. You can look in the popular press, just out in the newspapers and websites, and I'm often surprised at the quality of some of the material I find in some of these articles. They're full of good statistics, so when you do research for some of your papers, particularly for this class, or maybe other CRS courses that you're going to take in the future, you might find those useful in fact, because they have such good statistics. The FDA and then food and drug vendors have a lot of good stuff. There are disease-specific organizations, so the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, for example, has a lot of good material. And then, like I said, the AARC. And then there are proprietary sources. Again, that would be like the subscription-only websites. Make sure you know where not to look for information, and make sure you tell your patients where not to look for information. So how do you know if it's good? Well, there are a few ways. You have to read it, and you have to read it objectively. And when you read it objectively, you have to determine if it was written objectively. So take a look at that. If the whole point of whatever they're writing is to sell you their product, it's not good for you to pass it on to your patients. Make sure that the reading level is appropriate for your patients, and you may find that it's useful to have multiple different articles and handouts for different diseases, or the same disease in like 5 or 6 different formats, so you can have the one that's appropriate for your patient on hand at any time. There are some formulas, the SMOG or the FRI formula, which you can Google if you're interested in seeing, that will help you determine what the appropriate reading level is for a person based on their age and their English skills. Evaluate the language. If there's a whole lot of jargon or technical terms in the article, then it's not going to be useful to a lot of patients. If you are using translated material, make sure that, number one, it makes sense. Sometimes things get lost in translation, particularly if you're not moving from one Romance language to another. So if we translate something from German or French or Italian or Spanish, it generally translates relatively well. It's not really hard to translate things. If you're looking at something in Japanese, though, if you don't know anything about the Japanese language, they use about half as many words as we do to relate the same piece of information. I mean, they say English is really hard to learn because we have so many extra words. We also have synonyms that other countries, other languages don't use. For example, sun, S-U-N, and son, S-O-N, have extremely different meanings. So you got to assess that, and when you are in doubt, find a professional translator and have them read through it. Again, watch out for the personal blogs. Some of it is good emotional reading, but it's really crappy reading in general. Maybe I'll post a few of these for you that are particularly bad. There are a whole bunch of them for neonates, like when parents have a preemie and they want to document their child's progression from birth to going home. Some of it's really bad. I mean, they'll say something like, his oxygen level was 85. Well, is that saturation, or was that a PO2? Was that on oxygen, or was that on room air? I mean, an oxygen level of 85 does me no good whatsoever. So I don't know if that's good or bad, and the people reading it don't know if it's good or bad. And so, I don't know, on an emotional level, it's good stuff, and it might get people engaged in the care of others, but from a clinical standpoint, it's, sorry to anybody who's ever blogged about a healthcare issue, but it can be real crap. Ha ha ha. It's cute, isn't it? All right, so what are we going to look for? We want to make sure that the layout is plain and easy to read, that the font size is large enough. If you're dealing with older people, and by older, I will put myself in this category, anybody over the age of 40 needs a larger print. It really sucks, but when you move to bifocals, it's time to look for larger print material. So when I say larger print, I don't even mean that old. I mean 40. So if you just stick with at least a 12 point, you're probably okay. Using italics and bold for emphasis is better than underlying, but sometimes underlying is okay. And I was also told by someone who is blind, who uses software that translates things that it reads into verbal, it like reads things to the patient. It was actually a student who was telling me that he had this software that would read things off the computer to him. He was not completely blind, though. He was legally blind. He was, I would say, probably 85% blind. But he told me that if he had a font similar to what you're looking at right now, he could read it. If you use Times New Roman, for example, there are little dots at the end of the letters and upturns that are not necessary, so it's not quite as block style. That was harder for him to see. So stick with really block style lettering fonts and you'll be better off with most patients. Make sure that the contrast between the background and the foreground or the words is really nice and sharp, and that your graphics are appropriate for your patient, and make sure that everything's in a logical order. So when you're looking at material, in conclusion, make sure that you are picking the right material for the right patient at the right time, and don't give them information overload. Just give them what they need when they need it. Make sure they know they can call you anytime, and explain to them that even if they can't call you realistically, let's say, for example, this is a patient that you see in the hospital and you show them how to use an MDI. They can't necessarily call you personally after the fact. You certainly don't want to be giving your phone number out to every patient that you deal with. But tell them when to call their doctor. Tell them they can follow up with their physician, or at least people who work in their doctor's office. And also tell them to follow up with their pharmacist. Often the pharmacist is a good person to get information from. But make sure that they understand it's okay to ask for more information, and that they're not locked in, so that they don't feel stupid if they can't remember how to do things later on. There are formulas to determine how long people retain information, and I'm not going to go into that in this class because I've taken whole classes on just that particular subject, and to be honest, it's dry and boring and it doesn't really matter. The bottom line is you have to assume that whatever information you give the patient, that under the best of circumstances, they will retain about 25% of it between today and tomorrow. By the day after tomorrow, they will only remember 50% of it, and the day after that, 75%, and so on. So within 4 days after you explain something to them, they're basically going to forget most of what you told them. So reiterating things and really encouraging them to do the follow-up and being taught by other people in other settings, it's important. And keep material as appropriate as possible for each patient. There are a lot of companies who will try to sell you a lot of things. I think the internet has actually made this worse. There are companies who specialize in fleecing patients. I mean, we've all heard the horror stories. But there was a patient I had years ago who was drinking something called ozone. I have no idea what this stuff was. For all I know, it was formaldehyde. Then again, it could have been a Mercure in a bottle. I don't know what it was. So he was asking me, have you ever heard of this stuff? It's great. It's wonderful. You should tell all your patients about it. Everybody should take this ozone stuff. And I'm thinking, no way, no way, no way. I don't know what it is. I'm certainly not going to validate or encourage other people to take this stuff. I didn't even want to encourage this particular patient to take it. The fact was the guy had COPD because he smoked 1 billion cigarettes in his life, and And if this made him feel better, it probably wasn't going to kill him any faster than all those cigarettes had already chosen to do so. But, you know, I didn't want to encourage him. I didn't want to discourage, because it was making him feel better. It could have been just a psychological thing. It puts you in a really bad position as a caregiver. So just, watch it and try not to encourage people to go overboard with stuff like that. In summary, we have learned how to recognize and analyze different materials, where to find the materials and the different types of materials. Those would be good vocabulary words, hint, 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 on a test. We've learned how to look for bias in language, and how to assess cost, and even how to find money for these things. Look for free samples. That's what the CDC is good for. I'm telling you, great stuff there. Provide appropriate sources for patient populations, different populations, and encourage people to go find their own stuff. But also, if they find something a little hinky, encourage the patient to bring it back to you and ask you for your opinion. So make sure you tell them, hey, if you find something on your own and you want to know if it's good or bad, bring it back to me, and we'll go over it together. And make sure that the material you present to the patient is conveying the message that you intend for it to convey. If you work at a Catholic hospital, they may have materials that are overtly religious, that help train patients through their diagnosis with a religious bias. And that might be okay in certain circumstances, but not everybody who walks into a Catholic hospital for treatment is in fact Catholic. So it's kind of hit or miss. So you may be in a situation where you don't have any choice but to offer patients this biased material, because that's what your boss tells you are going to do. But very rarely will your boss tell you you're not allowed to offer anything in addition to this biased material. And last, the bottom line, the whole enchilada here, is that the more information somebody has, the better decision they can make. We want to just help patients get into a position where they can make good, solid, educated decisions about their own health care, about their lives, and then they are more likely to not only like you, but be compliant. If they have bad information, it will lead to bad decisions, and that includes the person doing the training. So if you've been reading on these weird blogs about ozone, you might stop before it sinks in and you can't figure out how to talk without it. Thank you, and we'll move on to the next presentation.